Today we're going to talk about the end of the war, the Nuremberg trials, the Yalta conference, and the final death tolls for World War II. When we left off, we had talked about the Manhattan Project that was secretly running in the United States, and we talked about the decision Truman made because FDR had just died. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Truman had made the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Hiroshima death toll was a little bit larger than Nagasaki because of the lay of the land, but all told about 250,000. Japanese died due to the atomic bombs, and then an increasing number. It's difficult to pinpoint the actual totals because of the long-term health impacts of increased cancer rates and genetic mutations that occurred as a result of the bomb are difficult to calculate. So one of the questions we face at the end of the war then is this the kind of power that we want to have out in the world, kind of left unchecked, and how do we control this situation? This is a kimono pattern burned right into the flesh of a woman. The heat reacted in a really interesting, strange way. You could be anything from vaporized if you were at a certain radius to the atomic bomb. I mean, it was like 1600 degrees Celsius, and this portrait is the last portrait that was painted of Franklin D. Roosevelt. In fact, he was in Warm Springs, Georgia, when he died, amidst the painting of this portrait, and they had left the portrait unfinished to mark the moment of his passing. As you guys probably know, FDR was wheelchair bound. He could stand, but only with very thick metal braces. And what's kind of interesting about the time period is that at this point in history, the president was protected by the press. Most of the American public did not know that, and I think that in today's age, presidents are protected from very little, and this sort of secret would have never been kept. All right, so what is going on today? So the rebuilding after the war begins, and away we go. So with Japan's surrender, the Allies turned to the challenge of rebuilding all these war-torn nations. Even before the last guns fell silent, they began thinking about what were they going to do in this post-war world. So in February of 1945, which is again before the end of the war, it's not till September, right, on the Pacific Theater. In February of 1945, the Allies pushed toward victory in Europe, and an ailing Roosevelt met Churchill and Stalin at the Black Sea resort city of Yalta in the Soviet Union. Stalin graciously welcomed the president and the prime minister, and the Big Three, as they were called, toasted the defeat of Germany that now seemed certain. For 8 grueling days, the three leaders discussed the fate of Germany and the post-war world. Stalin, his country devastated by German forces, favored a really harsh approach. He wanted to keep Germany divided in occupation zones, areas controlled by Allied military forces, so that Germany would never again threaten the Soviet Union. Churchill strongly disagreed with that, and Roosevelt kind of was in the middle. First, he hoped that the Soviet Union would stand by its commitments to join the war against Japan that was still waging in the Pacific. Second, Roosevelt wanted Stalin's support for a new world peacekeeping organization to be named the United Nations. So FDR, in effect, kind of gave Stalin some of what he wished for in return for some free elections in Eastern Europe and support for the UN, and also making sure that he had an ally in that part of the world against Japan. The historic meeting at Yalta produced a series of compromises. To pacify Stalin, Roosevelt convinced Churchill to agree to a temporary division of Germany into 4 zones, one each for the Americans, the British, the Soviets, and the French. Churchill and Roosevelt assumed that in time all the zones would be brought together to reunite Germany. Stalin promised free and unfettered elections in Poland and other Soviet-occupied Eastern European countries, and Stalin agreed to join the war against Japan. That struggle was expected to continue for another year or more, and he agreed to participate in the international conference that would take place in April in San Francisco, and Roosevelt's dream of a united nations would there become a reality. By the way, Eleanor Roosevelt was actually the United States' very first delegate to the United Nations. She's the one that went to San Francisco, and Eleanor Roosevelt is quite an interesting woman. One of the very first active first ladies that took on like a political role, so she was interesting. All while her husband was cheating on her with his friend named Lucy. Besides geographic division, Germany had another price to pay for its part in the war. The discovery of Hitler's death camps led the Allies to put 24 surviving Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, and war crimes. The trials were held in the southern German town of Nuremberg, which is where Nuremberg trials gets its name. At the Nuremberg trials, the defendants included Hitler's most trusted party officials, government ministers, military leaders, powerful industrialists. As the trial began, the United States Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson explained the significance of the event. He said, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so devastating, that civilization just can't tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. It is hard now to perceive in these miserable men the power by which, as Nazi leaders, they once dominated much of the world and terrified most of it. Merely as individuals, their fate is of little consequence to the world. What makes this inquest significant is that these prisoners represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have turned to dust. They are living symbols of racial hatred, of terrorism and violence, and of arrogance and cruelty of power. Civilization cannot afford to compromise with the social forces which would gain renewed strength if we deal ambiguously or indecisively with the men in whom those forces now precariously survive." In the end, 12 of the 24 defendants were sentenced to death. Most of the remaining went to prison. In later trials of lesser leaders, more than 200 Nazis were found guilty of war crimes. Many people have argued that the trials did not go far enough in seeking out and punishing war criminals. Many Nazis who took part in the Holocaust did indeed go free. Yet no matter how imperfect the trials might have been, they did establish an important principle: the idea that individuals are responsible for their own actions, even in times of war. Nazi executioners could not escape punishment by claiming that they were merely following orders. The principle of individual responsibility now firmly entrenched in international law.
It's 1945 and World War II is over. Adolf Hitler is dead. So are his top lieutenants, Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels. But dozens of high-level Nazis are still alive and in prison. What do the Allied powers do with them? They take them to court in their own backyard. The Nuremberg trials were a series of international prosecutions that decided the fates of Nazi war criminals. Why hold these trials in the German city of Nuremberg? Well, for one, unlike a lot of German towns, Nuremberg was relatively undamaged by the war, and, just as importantly, the city had been the site of several infamous Nazi rallies. Prosecuting Nazi leaders there brought a symbolic closure to the Third Reich. The trials were administered by the four principal nations of the Allied powers: the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. However, each of these countries had their own laws and legal system, and had to settle on a common framework of justice. They couldn't try each defendant 4 different ways. So in August of 1945, they all sat down and hammered out the London Charter of the International Military Tribunal. With the London Charter, the Allies agreed that the defendants would stand trial and be allowed to have their own defense attorneys. Instead of a single judge, there would be a tribunal, 4 judges, 1 from each Allied country. The London Charter also defined the 3 major charges each criminal would face: crimes against peace, like planning and starting a war crimes, such as killing POWs, and crimes against humanity, In other words, killing civilians, as the Nazis did during the Holocaust. The trials lasted at Nuremberg from 1945 to 1949, but the highest profile cases were brought to court between 1945 and 1946. This period was known as the trial of the major war criminals. Among the 22 Nazi leaders on trial at Nuremberg were Gestapo founder Hermann Göring, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess, Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the German architect Albert Speer. 2 additional Nazis had been indicted, but one, Labor Chief Robert Ley, killed himself before the trials. The other, weapons manufacturer Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, was declared mentally unfit. He was senile. Starting in November of 1945, the tribunal heard testimony and reviewed evidence for 216 court sessions. The horrors and crimes of the Nazis were put on display for all the world to see. In October of 1946, the court handed down its verdicts. 12 death sentences, including those for Göring and Ribbentrop. 3 got life in prison. 4 got lengthy jail terms, and 3 were acquitted. Nothing could undo the devastation of the war. Nothing could bring back the millions of lives lost in the Holocaust, and the millions more lost in battle. But the Nuremberg trials were an important step towards rebuilding an international system of justice. They established important legal precedents for future international trials, including those for Japanese war criminals, and for trials decades later in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. The Nuremberg trials officially entered the crimes of the Third Reich into the historical record, so that there would be no doubt about what the regime had done.
The occupation of Japan. Japan was occupied by U.S. forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who's just to the right of your bottom right of your screen. In the early years of the occupation, more than 1,100 Japanese, from former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo to lowly prison guards, were arrested and put on trial. 7, including Hideki Tojo, were sentenced to death. In the Philippines, in China, and in other Asian battlegrounds, additional Japanese officials were tried for atrocities against civilians or prisoners of war. During the 7-year American occupation, MacArthur helped to reshape Japan's economy by introducing free market practices that led to a remarkable economic recovery. MacArthur also worked to transform Japan's government. He called for a new constitution that would provide for women's suffrage and guarantee basic freedoms. I believe initially the Japanese constitution gave suffrage to everyone over the age of 20. In addition to women's suffrage, they guaranteed basic freedoms, so pretty much added something that amounts to like our Bill of Rights. In the United States, Americans followed these changes with great interest. The New York Times reported that General MacArthur has swept away an autocratic regime by a warrior god and installed in its place a democratic government presided over by a very human emperor and based on the will of the people as expressed in free elections. The Japanese apparently agreed. To this day, their constitution is known as the MacArthur Constitution. In addition, it doesn't say this in your text, but the MacArthur Constitution is also pacifist, and as a result, the Constitution, I believe, makes it illegal to declare war under almost any condition. World War II was the costliest war, the most destructive war in human history. If you look at, rankings of wars, it is at the top very clearly, in part due to the death toll in places like China and the Soviet Union, and of course the Holocaust as well, in addition to all of the deaths at the hands of just war, regular war. I'd encourage you to spend a little bit of time looking at the numbers that are in front of you, because this literally shaped the post-war world and affected the way that you live to this day. We'll talk about that more in the next chapter.